Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Annique Simpson, and today I'll be exploring some academic research on leadership communication and different communication styles and the impact that has on leadership, on organizational and employee outcomes. So in terms of what I'll cover today, I'll start off with a very brief intro to myself. I then will look at, I'd like to share just make the case for leadership communication, or I'm sure you've probably heard it from other speakers as well, but I'd like to throw another statistic in the ring as to why it's important that us as internal communicators focus on leadership communication. I'll then dive into some of the research that I found quite interesting research that I found around on the topic from a variety of disciplines, including psychology, hence the title, Psyching Up Your Leaders. And I'll then finish off with some takeaways, some practical tips that we can use in our everyday practice to help improve leadership communication and make it as effective as possible. So a little bit about me. My name's Annique Simpson. I am an internal communications manager in the financial services sector based in London, UK. I have an undergraduate degree in psychology, and as part of my course, I was interested in organizational psychology, particularly, so human behavior in the workplace. And I'd say that's probably what led me to internal communications, and is one of my interest areas, alongside employee voice, employee experience, and also organizational and employee change. So before I get into some of the studies that I found on leadership communication that I've found to be quite interesting, I just wanted to throw a statistic in the ring that in terms of why we as internal communicators should be interested and want to invest our time in helping develop leadership. Of a finding that came out of a study by a researcher called Faraz Farabod and their colleagues in 2013, who found that leaders spend more than 75% of their time actively communicating with their employees. That's over 3/4 of the time, which makes sense when you think about it, but it's reassuring, I guess, to have that number in your back pocket, not only for yourself when you're doing your planning for communications, but also if you need to coax some of your leaders along or get investment from your businesses to use to help boost and improve line manager or senior leader communications, or both. I think it's really helpful, and for me, it just makes it just really demonstrates and make it quite clear that leadership is ultimately communication. Interaction with employees is a key part of leadership, and so it is worth investing in. So without further ado, let's plow into the studies and studies. I should also say that if you have any questions during this live chat, please pop them in the submissions box here or below. Not sure where it is, so it could be here or there, but somewhere on your screen, and I'll answer your questions at the end of my presentation. So just thinking about, just want to take a moment. And if you'd have asked me which communication styles for leaders did I think would lead to happy, engaged employees and positive organizational outcomes, productivity, performance, etc., I'd have just hazarded a guess and said, instinctively, I would feel that it's leaders who are engaging, who show that they care and show an interest in employees, and really want to two-way communication between leaders and employees. And if you shared that hunch as well, or have the practical experience around it, the research very much supports that. So I will say that a lot of the stuff that I talk about today will sound like common sense, and that's because it is. But it's more about reassurance from scientific data that you again can use personally if you have an interest in it, particularly if you have an interest in it, or also to share with your senior leaders. So looking at the research, it's quite clear, for me anyway, that the most important, one of the most important predictors of positive organizational outcomes in studies that have looked at leadership communication, either local leadership, so line managers or CEOs, is supportiveness. So leaders who are caring, who are friendly. So pretty much the hunch that I described earlier, who are friendly, who are caring, who show that they value employees, who show an interest in employees, and a compassion for them. Employees who have leaders who communicate with them in that way are more likely to have positive experiences in work and to perform well. So give you a couple of studies to verify that. So there was a study done with Dutch government employees, and so they did a few surveys, and it was looking at 6 different types of communication style and their impact on 4 leadership outcomes. And these were employees' perceived perceptions of leader performance, employees' satisfaction with their leaders, employees' commitment to be a part of their team and commitment to the team, and also the 2-way knowledge sharing between leaders and employees. And of the 6 communication styles they looked at, so they looked at supportiveness, argumentativeness, and this is all verbal communication, argumentativeness, precisiveness, supportiveness, and a few others. The only verbal communication style from leaders that was positively related to the 4 outcomes that I explained earlier was leader supportiveness. So again, these were friendly leaders who were friendly and kind in their communications, and so they gave an example statement to underpin that concept or communication style, and it was, my leader compliments other people. That was the only communication style that was impacted, that had a positive relationship. So it was associated with high levels of positive leadership outcomes. Another study that looked at CEO communication style looked at 2 types of communication styles. They looked at relative or relational communication style, responsive communication style, and assertive or aggressive communication style. And they found that employees who perceived their leaders, their CEOs, to have a responsive communication style, so who were friendly, who showed compassion, who were interested, warm, and sincere, those employees were more likely to highly rate the quality of their CEO communication, and were also more likely to have to report a positive relationship with the organization. And by when you look at employee and organizational relationship, what that means in sort of psychological terms is that it's all about trust, and employees feeling like they're trusted by organizations, that they are empowered by organizations, that they're cared about by organizations, that they are able to get involved and encouraged to get involved and be part of their organization and valued by that organization. For CEO communications, being responsive, and responsive is very similar, I think, to the verbal supportiveness in the previous study that I described. And this was this CEO study, was studied by a researcher called Lin Men, and that was in 2016. Men also looked at the role of social media, CEO presence on social media, and how that impacts or is related to the 2 different communication styles, and also communication quality rating from employees and employees' rating of their relationship with the organization. And they found quite similarly that CEOs who had a stronger social media presence, and that's internal and external social media, employees felt that they were more responsive communicators, and so therefore rated them higher as having high quality communication, the CEO having high quality communication, and also reported a stronger relationship with the organization, which shouldn't, for me wasn't surprising. Again, reassuring, not surprising, because social media is the heart of it is meant to mimic traditional face-to-face channels. And so we know that face-to-face channels are important and effective in terms of communication, leadership communication. So it would make sense that social media would have a similar effect, albeit slightly more weaker. slightly weaker, sorry. So that's really looking at, those two studies looked at CEO and team leader or line manager communication during the BAU conditions. An interesting study looking at change communication found quite similarly that supportive and employee-centric communication again is linked to positive employee outcomes. So this study was by a researcher called Luau and some colleagues in 2016, and they looked at the impact of different different leader communication styles during change, and the impact on a single employee outcome. And that employee outcome was effective commitment to change, employees' effective commitment to change. Effective commitment to change is the emotional attachment and the desire and drive to support organizational change. So it's employees' will to the commitment to change. That's an effective commitment to change. And effective commitment to change has been linked in other research to has been a strong predictor of employees' willingness to take on the new change actions and to behave in the new ways as dictated by the change. So when they looked at the leadership communication, they found 3 elements that were key to high levels of employee effective commitment to change. And the change that they looked at, I should have said, was around HR changes and marketing changes, a variety of changes in organizations. The first element of communication, a leadership communication style that was linked to high levels of effective commitment to change, was hope orientation. And that was when leaders indicated that change was promising and achievable in the near future. So they would use stories, the vivid and fascinating stories. They would use colourful and emotive language and provide employees with encouraging examples of the change. The second element was subordinate, or what I call employee orientation, employee communication style, focused communication style, and that was the what's in it for me. So leaders showing that they care about or are consider the concerns of employees and focus their communication. Leaders focusing their communication on the benefits that the change can bring for the employees, and so they would use lively, caring language, flexible and friendly language, and very much couch their communication around the employees and the employees' interests, personal interests, and personal stakes in the as-is status, as well as the change status. And the third element that they found to be linked to high levels of employees' emotional commitment to change was support orientation, support communication style. And that was all around leaders being very definitive and very clear that the change will progress and showing their own commitment to the change. And as a result, also being willing to support employees and to offer as much support as possible to employees to help them move through the change. So language is very decisive and very, very committed, showing lots of commitment to the change. Interesting, they also found two other elements of the leadership communication during the change period that were part of the communication style of leaders, but were not linked, had no significant relationship with the employees' effective change. And that was reality orientation, which is very much around facts and figures to help people make a rational decision about change. So perhaps not surprising that rational communication style communication starts to focus on rational elements. It won't be linked to emotions because they're quite two separate processes. Another was enforcement communication style, and that was very much using commanding language, very authoritarian commanding language to move employees along. So when the researchers provided quite an interesting conceptual model to explain their findings, and it was around a psychological concept known as cognitive appraisal, the cognitive appraisal process for emotions. And that effectively states that in order to have emotional feelings about something, we first need to interpret about a situation or an event, we first need to interpret that situation or event. So you have the event happens, for example, the change. You then appraise it, so you look at the elements of it, and then you you have an emotion around that. So as I said, change is the event, and change is the event of focus. And what they think employees do is that employees use the communication style or elements of leadership's communications about the change. They use that to make interpretations about various elements of the change. So whether the change is going to be difficult or not, whether the change is a good change or not. And as a result of this cognitive appraisal process, they then this leads to employees having specific emotions about the change. And one of the emotions that is key, or the authors thought was key, was the fear of change. Now, we all know the fear of change can completely derail the change process and the change program or projects. So it's important that you kind of reduce that fear in employees in order to increase the chances of the change and them wanting to be involved in change, feeling able to be involved in the change. And so what hope, subordinate or employee orientation, and support orientation does is they reduce the fear of change. This is the author's sort of model, as part of the model. They reduce the fear of change. So in different ways. So hope orientation, hope communication style, reduces the change anxiety about the future in employees. Subordinate or employee orientation reduces the fear of personal loss that can be associated with change, and also it addresses the concerns that employees might have, other concerns that employees might have about change. And support orientation, so the support communication element, and that reduces the fear of employees' fears of not having the right support, the support that they need in order to progress with the change and to do their part to help deliver on the change. So by reducing those fears, actually what leaders are doing as part of their communications, if they are reducing those fears by using those three elements, they are showing employees that change is safe. The change is safe, therefore creating a very fertile ground for employees to want to be emotionally attached to the change, so want to help to drive it forward, and then also to engage in behaviours that will allow the change to come about. The final, so we've talked about verbal communication. Obviously, we know that's very important, what leaders say and the different tools the different approaches that they can take in their communications. I now want to turn to nonverbal communication. This is an emerging area of research. Sort of the research is within the last sort of 5 or so years, but quite interesting. And you know that nonverbal communication is important. Sometimes as important, but sometimes can be more important than what is actually being said, particularly if there's a disconnect. So there's a study by Antonio Sacavem and colleagues in 2017, and they looked at two various conditions in which leaders displayed nonverbal communication, and it was conditions that had immediate nonverbal behaviours, and these were nonverbal behaviours such as nodding, smiling, leaning in to the audience, to employees, and it's all about creating psychological closeness. He also looked at the team also looked at dominant communication behaviours. Again, this was all about sort of nonverbal behaviours that exert influence and power. So lots of expansive postures, expressive faces and hand gestures. And then there was a condition where it was mixed between immediate and nonverbal behaviours, and then there was a condition where none of those behaviours were in existence. And what they found is that both immediate and dominant behaviours separately, and also mixed, were the best predictors of positive mood in employees. And the explanation they gave around that is a concept called mood contagion. And that effectively said that mood is contagious. If we are observing someone's behaviours, body movements, postures, we will mimic those behaviours subconsciously and consume and take on the emotions that we feel from those, that we interpret from those behaviors, and report that we feel those emotions too. So when it comes to immediate and dominant behaviors, because they're quite linked to positive effects, so nodding, smiling, we see that as something positive. Being powerful, confident, we see that as something positive often enough. The interpretation is that we subconsciously will mimic those behaviors, and those employees subconsciously mimic those behaviors, and therefore took on those emotions and reported that they felt positive mood as well. When it came to performance, it was only dominant behaviors, or a mixture of immediate and dominant behaviors, that were linked to high levels of employee performance. And that makes sense when you think about it, because if we have leaders who are confident, who are dominant, who want to be close to us and are drawing us in with their non-verbal sort of body language, the body language and the tone of voice, we're more likely to want to perform highly for them, or perform highly in their teams, because we feel encouraged, we feel it's a safe environment, and we feel that they really care about us. So those are the studies for today, and those are the studies that I looked at. So what does that mean for internal communicators? Well, just a few takeaways. And the first thing is really, how important it is to help our leaders create better relationships with employees. And central to that is that concept of leader supportiveness. Helping employees feel that leaders care about them, and also helping leaders show that the employees care about them. So really, in terms of what we can do, we can help to coach and advise leaders around recognizing colleagues' good work, putting employees first when they're communicating with them, so really answering the what's in it for them whenever they are interacting with them, whether it's at a town hall or just conversations in the corridor, and seeking feedback from employees. So not to be afraid, encouraging leaders to not be afraid of feedback from employees. So that's also quite important, and also encouraging direct connections between leaders and colleagues and employees, whether it's line managers or CEOs, as opposed to doing it perhaps through internal communication teams, for example, because that really helps to build empathy. And we know that empathy is an important part of building trust and trusting environments, which has been linked to various positive organizational outcomes and employee outcomes. Where that's not possible face to face, using social media as a tool to do that. Again, the research suggests that social media is CEOs are seen as being more responsive and more caring on social media. The second takeaway is really around organizational change. And during that time, leaders should be trying to emphasize the possibility of success of the change, so really raising those hope feelings and hope, perceptions of hope for employees, and providing continuous support during that change process. Again, very important, not just only during, but after as well. And also to make sure that employees can see ways in which they can benefit from the change. Again, most of this should be, feel like common sense, instinctive, and definitely is in line with the research on change communications and how to be impactful around that. And the third thing, which I think for me was probably the most surprising and the biggest takeaway, was around the importance of nonverbal communication. And I always knew that it was important, but to actually have findings and actually have specific elements of nonverbal behaviours through the research that I could sort of hang my hat on was really useful. And so it can be quite difficult, I know, to coach leaders around nonverbal communication, because it's about their body language, and how do you tell your CEO or head of to not be so stiff on stage, for example, or to be a bit more expansive or a bit more expressive in the face. But it's a conversation worth having, because it has been linked to positive mood in employees and employee performance. So really, some basic things, like getting them to smile more as they're presenting, to nod, to give eye contact, to have some movement in their face and dynamicity in their face and body, but also to feel relaxed and ultimately to be themselves. So that's the research, a quick canter through the research there. And so we do have some time for questions, so happy to answer any questions that you may have. And thank you for attending. I can't There doesn't seem to be any questions. I'll just hang about a bit more just to see if there's any questions that have come through. Well, I can't see any questions, and I think I'm about just up to my time. So thank you for attending. And if you do have any questions, I'll be in the IC chat. But also you can find me at Twitter at Annique_Simpson. Happy to connect and to share, any of the research I found if you're interested, or to answer any questions, or to have a conversation about any of the findings that I've shared with you today, or anything else in relation to leadership communication. So hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you for attending, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if anything, I hope that you were reassured that you either found something new, or if not, that you had your hunches reassured by the findings that I've shared with you today. Thank you.